Thank you so much. I just want to commend everybody in this room, and especially GBBC, for giving us this environment where we could speak candidly, where we can share our ideas that already have impact and will change our world. And it is, without further ado, that I would love to introduce you to our next panel, Strengthening Resources Through Supply Chains. The past few years, ouch, I mean, from trying to get a car to upgrade your bathroom in your home and get some cabinets and maybe order some furniture, food, shelter, education, I mean, you name it, and the list goes on. And the world woke up to a very powerful undercurrent called supply chains when it failed on many, many fronts and confronted all of us to the challenges of a global economy that tried to keep on the rails. But how will technology help strengthen our resources? So, Martin, I want to start with you. When you think about supply chains right now, what are the limitations? And in the context of what you're doing, what are the solutions that you see technology can bring?
Well, thanks very much. So I've been involved in commodity supply chains really all my career. And certain things in those supply chains have stayed the same throughout my career. And I'm now in my 60s. So some of that is about moving goods around the world, and that pretty much stays the same. The big impact that technology is happening, and it's really having in the last decade, I would say in particular, is to facilitate the movement of documentation, information, and information flow around the world. And when you think about the amounts of money which pass with those commodity flows and how important it is to all supply chains, that's extraordinarily important. And because by their nature, those supply chains are global, the role that technology places in terms of increasing security, first of all, and increasing speed is really critical. And I think that's surprised most of us as to how big a role it can play.
We talk about blockchain as a frictionless and a seamless technology. Daniela, when you work with your enterprise partners and you see the limitations of what we've all experienced in supply chains, this kind of reminds me of the conversation that you and I had even a couple months ago when you came on as a guest for Forkast about even how shipping companies can really reduce the friction that exists. But certainly, how do you see it in terms of the bigger picture when it comes to the technology application?
And I'll agree with you, right? It's a digital transformation story first, and there's a lot there that needs to be done before even the right technology gets selected into the process as well. I think what we're talking about is digital trust, and having trust in the systems from a security perspective, from an efficiency perspective, and from an open perspective. And this, at the Linux Foundation and at the Hyperledger Foundation, obviously this is a very important aspect, is having these technologies that are building these systems that are enabling the digital transformations of hundreds of different industries, and doing it in the open and transparently from a code perspective, from a standards perspective as well, so that we as consumers can trust the data and the information that's given to us, so that we understand, for example, when I'm buying an electrical car, that the battery was created and came from a very sustainable mine, and it has the regulatory requirements to doing it. And I think many of us in this room, and I know over the last 3 days, many of us who've been at this for 7, 8, and 10 years, we realize this is a long-term initiative. This is not something that gets fixed overnight, but But what we've seen in the last few years from organizations like Circulor, for example, that have these systems in production that are really moving assets and value across the networks and providing that digital trust or that transparency to the consumer makes it more and more important. So I want to come back every single year, Sandra, and talk about the advancements that we're doing, what we're delivering, because it's really amazing to see us come together globally and do that.
And Alasdair, I want you to jump in here. From your perspective, obviously, from a sustainability standpoint, supply chain is one thing, and getting it end to end is another. But the process in which we have to hold ourselves accountable, that we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard, because that is what increasingly the world demands of itself.
Thanks, Angie. So I mean, as you've mentioned, when customers look at products, they're increasingly thinking about, okay, what's the environmental impact of that product? And the only way that we can really understand exactly what that is through data and creating systems that allow for this transparent flow of information related to whatever product it is through a supply chain. And so a lot of all the work that we do within IETA is around creating standards, creating taxonomies that allow us to express, okay, what's the embedded carbon in this item, be it a good or a service, and allowing that information to flow between different users along a supply chain. And I think increasingly that's going to become substantially more relevant, particularly as governments start implementing compliance schemes around carbon markets and the role that they need to understand exactly what's the embedded carbon of this project or product as it moves into our jurisdiction.
Doug, how do you think about it at Circulor when you think about the limitations of current supply chains and how to improve it?
So current supply chains are murky at best, and certainly in terms of the manufacturer's understanding of what goes on beyond their tier one supplier. And the context, I'm picking on a couple of themes from others. The European Commission Parliament has just put in place the European battery regulations, which creates the first digital product passport for EV batteries and other similar lithium-ion batteries, requiring demonstration of responsible sourcing all the way back to mined or recycled material, and a per battery carbon footprint. And most of that is inherited from the supply chain, scope 3 emissions in the jargon. And that means that you're following materials from all over the world, multiple materials, multiple tiers of the supply chain, up to 7, with differing participation from those actors within the supply chain over time. It's pretty complicated, to the point that Daniela was making, that this is a multi-year journey. And it is an environment in which distributed trust is fundamentally important to not just the consumer, but also regulators. I mean, we all know that industries like the mining industry have a, let's put it politely, a colourful history. And many of the raw materials that we all rely on for the energy transition come from colourful places like the Congo, where there are concerns around forced labour, child labour, unsafe working practices, and that's just one example. It's the process of shining a light on what's going on in the deeper tiers of supply chains is important, because responsible and sustainable business is something I think most of us care about. But the point that you were making at the very start, actually, is that the digitization of supply chains also unlocks a significant efficiency benefit. Whether the reason for that digitization is initially around responsible and sustainable business, once you have digitized a process, you have the ability to get rid of some of that horrific inefficiency of post-trade, and also to underpin things like proof of origin for things like the Uyghur labor law in the US, or the Inflation Reduction Act, which requires a calculation, for example, of economic value add. So there are many potential benefits unlocked from the sort of work that we're touching on in this panel.
So I think we're seeing the challenges of supply chains with these microphones.
But we share.
And reliability of supply, but we're collaborating, which is another of the themes. So, but I think the point about, I think that you brought up about the integrity of the data and reliability is really critical, because these issues have been around for a long period of time. I mean, I chair the board of a company called VAKT, which was set up by a bunch of energy companies and banks to digitize post-trade services initially in oil markets on a blockchain. It's operating in that way now, initially in oil markets and then extending into other energy and emissions markets. And one of the key drivers of that was that there's been a problem forever in these markets, which is that you don't know what you're getting, and even when you've got it, and if it's stored somewhere, it could disappear. And that's a problem for everybody in that supply chain. It's a problem for banks, it's a problem for suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. The only people it's not a problem for are criminals, as you're alluding to. So everyone's got a community of interest to try and really follow through what those trade flows are. And the key thing about that is that once you've established the trade flow, and once you've established that community around a particular trade flow, then you can add all the other things onto it. You can add, well, where does it come from? Exactly the issues that you've been talking about in terms of certification of origin. But you need to have the trade flow first, because otherwise the end users don't want to get all of this from a whole different series of places, because if you're getting it from a whole different series of providers, you're back to the same problem. How can I rely on it?
Yeah, and actually you're implying an important point, which I think I want to bring out here, which is that obviously this is a blockchain event, and our platform uses a blockchain. The example you gave uses a blockchain, but of itself, it isn't the answer. The ability to secure primary data or receive primary data, to check it for anomalies, to potentially scrub it and harmonize it with third-party data prior to notarizing transactions onto a blockchain is really important to that future trust. You alluded to it, like every IT system, rubbish in, rubbish out.
Yeah, we don't want the rubbish at all. And if transparency is going to be the greatest sanitizer, as we hope that, obviously everybody in the supply chain, from end user to to source and everybody in between, it also behooves the industry to make data, be part of our thesis at Forkast Labs, make data usable and accessible, and in a way where people can understand, instead of the plethora of data, understand the specific value intent of that data. How do we get there for supply chain?
Let me give you one example, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but yes, you collect a lot of information. You then have to present it to someone as a version of the truth. And that version, you mentioned light is a great disinfectant. That version of the truth is a starting point to a journey of where are my anomalies? Where are the risks in my supply chain? What do I do about it? And actually surfacing those insights is fundamentally important to some action, because otherwise, frankly, you've got some pretty dashboards which look nice on PowerPoint slides, but that's about it.
Well, I mean, slides are nice, but it really, is it usable data? Alasdair, I want to ask about IETA, advancing blockchain implementation for climate markets across supply chains. It's a huge task, obviously. Where do you think the world is going? Is the technology and the innovation there yet? Are we there yet? If not, what else needs to happen in terms of implementation and adoption?
So I would say we're very nearly there. I think from a technology standpoint, a lot of the questions have been solved. The issue is that the industry needs to understand how they utilize these tools that they're being provided. And so a lot of the work the IETA is doing is, in partnership with the World Bank and the government of Singapore, creating kind of decentralized data layers that transparently surface data on carbon markets. And so what we've done is we've launched something called Climate Action Data Trust at the end of last year in Singapore, which aggregates data from both national and independent registries to create a single source of truth. What's the logic behind that? The thinking is, okay, historically the integrity of carbon markets has been questioned. And as Douglas has said, the best way to kind of address those concerns is to shine light on it. So until we have a complete overview of the state of the market and what the carbon credits look like, we can't really move beyond that. And then going forwards, as companies look to create carbon neutral products, they can just inherently rely on the quality of the credits. So it's this automated, seamless process where they don't need to think or evaluate the projects. And then we can really start scaling the market. And it makes supply chains much easier.
Daniela, over at the Linux Foundation, what you're doing at Hyperledger Foundation, is it about the technology? or is it about something more? Is it about the application? What's more important?
Well, both work together, and if they don't work together, we're not going to get results. But technology, to Alasdair's point, it has been proven. It's scalable. It is mature. It has a very healthy commercial ecosystem supporting the companies that want to do implementations. There's been some failures, but many lessons learned and earned, I like to say, on those. And there's been business models that just didn't work because they weren't ready, and some were too early, and some are going to be too late. So I think that from a technology perspective, it's the evolution of the technology as well. At Hyperledger, since 2016, we've really been the home for enterprise distributed ledger frameworks. We now have tools and libraries that are addressing how these ecosystems work, from digital identity, for example, where we have like Hyperledger Aries, which is an agent. It doesn't need to work with a blockchain, right? It can work independently, and there might be implementations that a good old-fashioned database is good enough for you, but then blockchain-related technologies are enabling the business trust level as well. So digital identity, frameworks, and interoperability. We've always said these are always going to be networks of networks. One supply chain of one is not going to be fun. So how do we make sure that these assets and the data can also be moved interoperably between systems, regardless of which platform the vendor or the companies choose? So for us, that's really important. It's got to be open, it's got to be mature, and we're moving all these projects through that maturity project cycle so that everybody here in the room and beyond can feel confident that these technologies are ready to go prime time. Just figure out the business model and go.
And it has to be universal, it has to be standardized. And Martin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Daniela says is really right. I mean, I've been involved now in 3 different distributed ledger platforms, all of which are operating, all of which have got different use cases. But which have got certain common characteristics, which are around certainty, security, confidentiality, the things which we associate with the headlines of blockchain. And the things which made each of them work was the deep involvement of the users in developing that use case. So it's not the technology which leads to the application. I've also seen any number of proposals for blockchain platforms which went absolutely nowhere. It's not the technology which makes it work, it's the use case.
The use case has been really tested these past couple of years. I would love for you each to share, under the stress test conditions of COVID and now geopolitical tensions and the like, where have you seen this technology really change things in a way that it would have been a huge problem otherwise? And maybe Doug, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously COVID did 2 things. First of all of us became expert epidemiologists, and the second is we all kept some understanding of supply chains because we couldn't buy loo paper. And so I found that the conversation not only with investors but also with customers has changed. And the reason for that is that everybody recognizes that a lack of understanding of their supply chain, whether that's from a risk perspective, from a supply chain resilience perspective, or because they're being pushed towards more sustainable and responsible business practices, is now mission critical. I was fortunate this morning to be in a round table with a number of CEOs talking about the circular economy, and they all talked about supply chain traceability and greater transparency. I cannot conceive that 3 years ago I'd have been, well, one, I probably wouldn't have been participating in the conversation, or even that conversation would have been happening at all. So now, clearly, 2022 was wholly unusual from a macroeconomic environment off the back of COVID. But I suspect we're coming into, and Sandra, you asked for some optimism earlier, everybody has included now stagflation, higher interest rates in their business plans and in their thinking, which means that we have the potential to shift from a focus on the merely urgent to things that are genuinely important, we all recognize are going to take a long period of time. And one of those is grappling with the supply chain challenges, things like Scope 3 emissions and all the rest of it.
Alasdair.
So maybe without trying to sound too repetitive, going back to kind of the origins of climate action data trust and why we settled on blockchain. And we spent a lot of time trying to work out, okay, how and what this platform will look like. And one of the biggest challenges we had is you've got 196 governments many of which don't want to talk to each other. They certainly don't want to be part of the same initiative, and they don't want somebody else controlling their own data. And so having a highly decentralized ledger that everybody controls their own data seemed to be kind of the only solution that we could come across. And that's where blockchain makes a lot of sense, where you all want to be collectively sharing data, where you all want to have ownership of your own data. You want to be able to access or control who has access to that data. Blockchain really is the only solution that answers all of those questions. And I think we'll see that on supply chains, where you have numbers of different parties that don't necessarily want to communicate, but will continue to do the business together. And blockchain really remains the only answer to those questions.
Can you share one specific example? Tell us a story.
So we ran through a kind of long consultation, and we asked a number of governments, what kind of platform would you like? Would you feel comfortable sharing your data on this specific platform? And questions that kept coming up is, so who owns this data? Who owns the platform? And we had a conversation with the government of China and the government of Taiwan. We want both of them to share data. Getting them both to communicate is an uphill struggle. But having a registry platform that aggregates all these unique owners of their own data into a single source of truth, it can only be done by blockchain.
For international relations, that's a spectacular achievement. But it is also the promise of this technology and why everybody wants to engage. Daniela.
I think, in this macroeconomic world that we live in today, open source is one of the answers, right? Having companies come together to build core infrastructure, core protocols, and doing it together, it decreases the cost of their engineering and their development, right? They are building value on top of what the community is building. So you can build bigger, faster, and cheaper, right? And you can deploy the engineering talent that you have to build the applications and that value add of what you're bringing to market. So open source, and we see this over and over again, Linux Foundation has been at this for 20 plus years, where we see when there's an economic downturn, companies come and they say, hey, we've been working on this code piece, and we're seeing that in blockchain and identity. We're working on this. We feel that we can go faster and farther if we do it under the Linux Foundation as an open source project with open governance for the community and the industry to build upon. And I think that's really important. And I 2022 was a little bit rough, but what we're hearing, what we're seeing from large companies and small companies, exactly that is, where can we save money and go faster by working together? And open source is one of those places.
Violently agree, by the way. Violently.
And I got to agree with that, because when you reduce the adoption barrier, you actually democratize access for ideas to actually come into play. And that's the exciting thing, when you can open it up and as many people as who wants to can participate. Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I think Alasdair expressed really, really well the use case for blockchain, so congratulations on that. And I think it points to one thing, which in my opinion, is not so much the pandemic, which and some of the issues around that which have accelerated the uses, but it's the cyber security issues, right? In each one of the use cases that I've been involved in, it's people have got very sensitive information that they want to exchange, and they've realized that little old email gets hacked, right? And they want to get off this information off little old email, right? And that is a big driver. So that's not really a complicated situation. It's something that everybody's aware of now. But people have realized that if you can reduce the flow of information, put it on one secure platform with all the advantages that Alasdair so articulately laid out, that's very powerful. And actually, Angie, with respect, I mean, in the wholesale markets, people generally don't want to democratize, right? Because if you open it up to too many people, then you start to lose some of that. So it doesn't mean to say that other people can't come in, but you want to control who comes into that system.
But part of it is, that is a wonderful point, because I think that is a tension that remains between enterprise and public use. If the consumer is, at the end of the day, our collective audience, and they want to participate, how can they with the blockchain technology? Are there avenues and systems that can put in place where the wholesalers and the private enterprise can, you know, have their business parameters respected and protected, but at the same time feel like they want to engage with the end user, the consumer?
I mean, blockchain is an enabling technology. I mentioned earlier the example of the European battery passport. Ultimately, the target of that battery passport is the consumer. The fact that the data might have involved blockchain and other technologies is frankly neither here nor there. You buy an electric vehicle and you want to be assured that it's been responsibly and sustainably manufactured. And of course, you know, that consumer pressure is important also to driving the adoption of electric vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly we're talking about supply chains rather than markets, which is why I took that example. But I think it is accessible, and I suspect, and I've been part of conversations in this very room where, you know, we looked ahead and thought that blockchain would just be an enabling technology, that, you know, the benefits of it would be felt by consumers without necessarily having to engage with blockchain themselves. And you know, that is just one example of where I can start to see that coming to fruition.
What are some of the design considerations then? Daniela.
For building those ecosystems?
That's right, in implementing blockchain for supply chain applications.
Well, the way that we approach things at the Linux Foundation, for example, I was just at a panel discussion around open wallet, creating an open wallet engine, is to, when you're starting to do the development of the code and the standards, to having the diversity of voices, to having the public sector, the government officials in the room early, bring your lawyers early in too, but also having human rights groups and advocacy groups that are working to make sure that, you know, just basic, you know, humic principles are being applied. Right. So when you don't do that, when you start developing things, and even industries, we are market-making industries. In the last 7-10 years in the blockchain space, there have been many industries that have been created. So we make these markets, and how do you do that responsibly? You bring in the community, the consumer, and not necessarily to slow things down, but to make sure that the end game of what you deliver to the marketplace, whether it's an open source code base that everybody can use, or a product itself, or a regulation, that the individual consumer at that level has had a voice. And I think that's really important, and, you know, a big focus of what we do here at the Linux Foundation.
There are two philosophies to this. One often that we've seen in the financial markets has been around the idea of a genuine consortium of banks, for example, coming together. The example you talked about, which is the same as the one we've applied, is that of a coalition. You know, so you have participants who do not need to be directly connected, but that are nevertheless contributing to the requirements of what it is that needs to be created. Now, in the earlier panel, we were talking about the importance of trust, et cetera, and we've all seen high-profile failures. The challenge with, you know, many platforms is you do need someone to be the architect and the engineer, even if it is supposed to have a public good. Unfortunately, the idea that this would somehow evolve autonomously, I think, is not yet real.
Well, I think that's spot on. I mean, wearing, you know, one of my other hats, I'm about to join the board of the London Metal Exchange, and I previously ran the energy business at CME and Exchange Group. And there's a reason why exchanges exist, and there's a reason why operators of platforms exist, which is it's very difficult for market participants to do it by themselves. Because people don't agree.
And if they do it by themselves, there's a question of whether or not you trust the data they put on it.
That's right.
Well, we're doing it in the backdrop of Davos, and one of the themes, obviously, really is about collaborating. And during this very, you know, fractured time of ours in fragmented space, and this technology, in a very eloquent way, Alasdair, thank you for sharing that. That was a very powerful example. But how can we think about it at the next level? As you investigate your supply chains, how are companies taking out that rubbish, as you said, Doug? You know, rubbish in, rubbish out. So how do we take out that rubbish, the emissions associated with different processes, and then also cleaning up that data information for blockchain?
You can't manage something you can't measure. So that starts with gaining some, even an imperfect, understanding of what is going on within a supply chain. And then the ultimate customer can start to impose greater demand on improvement in anything from human rights to environmental performance to lower scope 1 and 2 emissions inherited alongside the materials that they're consuming.
This question is for all of you. You talked about collaboration. You talked about whether or not it's coming together as a coalition or collaboration. They differ. And so how are the companies engaging with each other from, and Daniela, this is for you, how are the companies engaging with each other from the philosophy and from the value of open source?
Well, like I said, it's not just companies, right? We have the public sector and associations and organizations and academics. Academics are so important to this conversation as well. And one of the things is we're actually, working on problems like, I want my EV car to be sustainably manufactured and delivered to me, have no doubt. But I also want my daughter to have food in 20 years' time and water. So there are like critical issues in our society today, from climate control to food and sustainability across the world, that these technologies do have. Big companies, they have goals that they need to meet, but the consumers and the people that work at those companies, we're the ones that need to bring that forward. So for us, I think it's just so important to have these conversations to highlight the projects that are working and that are being successful, to work with the nonprofits and the emerging economies that are struggling with digital transformation, that are struggling to bring equality to their people. And there's so many aspects of it that blockchain is just one thing, right? There's and so it's just I don't know how to put this. It is our moral responsibility to come together, whether we're developers, whether we're regulators or business people, and solve these problems, because we need to eat. And I'm not going to Mars with Elon.
I'm with you. I'm going to hang out here with you. Martin?
Well, I think that's very well said. And I think one of the things that the technology does, in my experience in these situations, is it drives standards in all sorts of activities. Because generally speaking, we humans, we compromise on a lot of things. And it's surprising what does get compromised on. So if I talk about, VAKT, the company I'm chairing, oil markets, you'd say those were pretty sophisticated markets which have been around for a long period of time. But actually the consistency of something like a confirmation is not really standard across that market. But once you put it into a piece of technology with a series of fields, then it's got to be standardized, right? People have got to either say, yes, I'm filling in that field, or I'm not filling in the field, it's not applicable. They can't just say, I hope the vessel will get loaded and shipped before we actually have to agree on that. And we'll hope that nothing goes wrong. And you can see that in all sorts of different markets, that the standardization which the technology requires is contentious in itself, so it forces that debate about governance.
Well, and it's multi-level too, not only from a retail perspective all the way up to enterprise, but also regulators and between countries.
There's a journey to that nirvana, by the way. I mean, in the critical minerals space, clearly there's a global competition for critical raw materials, particularly those that underpin the energy transition, and an absolute profusion of definitive standards, all of which tripping over each other. It's utterly horrific. And of course, this will sort itself out. Daniela mentioned interoperability, which I keep reminding people is not about interoperability between blockchains. It's about interoperability between systems, which is the terminology you used, because of the passage of data between systems is something we already know how to do. But there are some industries grappling with these supply chain challenges where standards are too numerous to actually be standard at all.
Let's do some crystal ball gazing for this room, but you guys are actually the authors of what we will see in the next 4 to 5 years. And so when it comes to supply chain management, supply chain seamlessness, frictionless, and the interoperability between systems and ease of data and transparency, what are the top trends that we're going to see applied that we'll all be, we will all enjoy in 5 years? And I'll start with you, Martin, and I'll go this way.
We'll see the same trends that we've seen for 30 years, which is more transparency. Transparency does shine a light and lead to governance, and we'll see more of that, and we'll see more market participants in everything, and more participants and decentralization. That's what the technology does. But we will find, I'm afraid, and that won't be popular in this room, that it will take us longer than we all think, because for all the reasons we've been talking about, it's just hard to agree.
When I joined the Hyperledger Foundation in 2017, I used to say my goal is for people to stop talking about blockchain, right? The technology is the enabler, right? And blockchain is a world, we love blockchain, we are all about blockchain, but you don't need to talk about blockchain. So I think what we're going to see is a shift of that. We're already seeing a shift. I know there are many companies, very large brands, who have very production-based implementations of blockchain, and they won't talk about it. They support us in their different ways, and the reason is because their stockholders don't feel comfortable about it. But that's okay, because when we go to a website, we don't go to a website and say, wow, this website was built with excellent JavaScript. Unless you're a geek, you might look at the code and do that. But ultimately, that website is working, and that's all you care from a consumer perspective. So my last word would be, blockchain is a technology enabler, and it's not the thing that makes us get to where we want with supply chain.
Alasdair.
So, I mean, I think I fully concur with both Martin and Daniela's sentiment in terms of where blockchain is going to go over the next few years. Without sounding too repetitive, and I think we've heard this across a number of different panels at Davos, I think tokenization of real-world assets is going to be incredibly important. And it's not just, okay, tokenizing carbon credits, because, okay, that's valuable in itself. The ability to tokenize negative externalities, be it carbon, be it water, be it biodiversity, and then linking that directly to a product, that's going to be incredibly helpful. And that will go towards Daniela's sentiment in terms of, let's put blockchain in the background. It shouldn't really be something we're talking about, but we want to have that data. Because at the end of the day, climate change is effectively a data problem. And the more data we have on chain that's transparent and seamless, the quicker we address this.
Doug gets to bring it full circle.
So my 5-year hope relates to supply chains. 8 global supply chains account for 50% of all global carbon emissions. By further digitizing those supply chains over the next 5 years, we will hopefully see significant progress in grappling with the inherited emissions through supply chains caused by all of our consumption of stuff.
It's stuff that we consume, but I hope it's ideas that really move you to action. And thank you to our panelists for really help illuminate the importance of the transparency at every step of the way. It's important not only for business, governments, and enterprise, it's important to the end user, which is all of us. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Angie.